Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Karen Wolfe Churgin walked her dogs on April 18, 1990, on a remote wooded property on Chebacco Road. The veterinarian spotted a white sphere obstructing a drainage ditch. When she reached to dislodge it, she reeled back in horror. She immediately called the police. "I saw something in the woods that looked like a punched-in volleyball," Karen told the Beverly Times on April 25, 1990. "I looked closer and it was a human skull. It had suture-like zigzagged lines. Those are unique to human skulls." Officer Hatfeld was the first to respond, and the initial conclusion determined discovery was indeed a human skull. Hamilton Police Chief Walter Cullen arrived at the scene next and photographed the find. The Massachusetts State Police Crime Prevention and Control Unit, CPAC, dispatched Corporal Dennis Marks to take charge of the crime scene. Local police sent the skull and a nearby black boot to Hunt Memorial Hospital to examine, but nothing else surfaced in the initial cursory search of the surrounding area. Notices went out to departments to assist the resident force, and names poured in to compare the cranium to known missing persons. Joan Webster's name appeared on the list, but the resting spot was more than 30 miles from the long-speculated crime scene at Pier 7 in Boston. Of course, it's being checked out, but the location doesn't seem to correlate. Circumstances pointed to her being taken out in a boat and dumped at sea. The book that we're featuring this evening is Mummies, a MOLE-Unraveling the Joan Webster Murder and Other Secrets in a CIA Family, with my special guest, journalist and author, Eve Carson. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Eve Carson.
Thank you, and I appreciate being here very much.
Thank you very much. This is
great.
Thank you. This is a very interesting, unique story, and quite complicated story, as we spoke about just before the program started. So let's get into a little bit of who the major players are in this, and let's start with basically give us what your background is and when you met your husband and before you met the family of the Webster family itself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background, and then proceed from there a little bit.
Okay. I grew up in Danville, Illinois. It's a small town in the Midwest. Most of my upbringing is in the Midwest. Went to college at Purdue University, graduate of 1974 in economics and industrial management. Not exactly the background one might think of for delving into an old murder case, but certainly this one has very significant importance for me. Met my husband after I'd graduated from college. He'd gone to college in Lake Forest, Illinois, and met through a mutual friend in Indianapolis. We dated for a couple of years and then got married in 1980. Joan was his baby sister.
And what's his name, Steve?
Steve.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no. I began meeting the family in 1977, so I'd known Joan for several years. The book is really about her, although I put in some personal experiences with the family. It's a very unique family. Both of Joan's parents, or Steve's parents, had been part of the CIA in their early years, so they have a very interesting background, one in intelligence, which was part of the reason I really started to dig into this case when the pieces just really didn't add up. They're intelligent, educated people that make this a much more complex story than what it really should have been. Joan was the youngest of three children, and she had worked in New York City for a number of years before deciding to go back to school. She went and became part of the graduate program for the School of Design at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very bright young woman. Lovely. Just giggled, kind, would do anything for anyone. She was a wonderful part of my life. And as I've gone through this case, she's become even that much more important to me. I really appreciate and value who she was as a person, and this is an important case to look at. At the time that she disappeared, she was in her second year at Harvard, and she had flown back early from a Thanksgiving break in Glen Ridge, New Jersey, which is where her parents lived. And she went back Saturday night versus Sunday, which was a little bit unusual and didn't really make much sense for quite some time. But she disappeared from Logan Airport the night she flew back to Boston, November 28, 1981. A lot of people have the perception that this case was resolved, but it is an open murder case in Essex County, Massachusetts. It was, at the time, it was highly publicized. This ran in the media, not only in the New England area, but actually there was some national coverage on it as well. But this was long before the Internet and cable TV, so it got a lot of attention for the type of case that it was, and certainly got more publicity than most. There were some.
Now, Joan was in school, but it was a student that first informed the family that she had missed some classes. So tell us about that day in question, November 28th, and tell us what, if it seemed unusual to anybody, any conversations with people that seemed cryptic or pointed to any kind of distress or anything unusual. Tell us about that day and the people around her and the entire circumstances of that day itself.
Absolutely no signs of distress whatsoever. The family had gone to a couple of friends' homes before they took Joan to Newark Airport that evening, the Whitpens and the Joys, both families that I know, and she would have had contemporaries there. Friends of hers would have been there. Police reports indicated that everyone saw Joan as everything being perfectly normal. She was happy. She was upbeat. Matter of fact, she was very enthusiastic about a project that she had just completed before the break and had gotten very high marks on. No one noticed anything out of the ordinary. Her sister also lived in the Boston area, so it was a little confusing why she had gone back early when ordinarily she would have ridden back with her sister the next day to the Boston area. The way the story came out was that she went back early to work on a project that she was going to present, and that wasn't the case at all. She had just completed it. Matter of fact, the year before, she had missed her Thanksgiving break because the workload was so heavy. So to me, going back through this and trying to piece this all together, that was a very unusual circumstance for her to have gone back.
Now that story was derived, or without any corroborating witnesses, as you say, from the father. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. He came out and said she'd gone back early. He indicated that she'd gone back early to work on a project with classmates. And nothing in police reports or the files that I've been able to recover corroborate that whatsoever. No statements from fellow students, etc. Most of the students were very confused and concerned, but didn't notice she was missing until she missed classes on that following Monday. It wasn't until several years later that George Webster, her father, indicated that she had made a call Saturday morning to a classmate to confirm that they had supplies for a project. That didn't match up with the police reports at all. They had checked the home phone numbers, but they did not check George Webster's private number. That number was missing from the police records. And I suspect that he didn't report it, and no investigator would know that that number existed unless, they wouldn't know it was missing from police reports unless they knew that that number existed. That was a confidential line that he used. It sat in his office.
Now, when Joan went missing and the news came to the family and to your husband, Steve, What was his reaction and what was your reaction? It was very interesting, the facts of this. Tell us.
I had a miscarriage the same night that Joan disappeared. We didn't know it for 3 days, but at the time that we got the call from Steve's mother, Eleanor, I was at home still trying to recover, very weak. I was hemorrhaging. He got the phone call and came running into the bathroom where I was at that time and actually got very angry with me because I started to cry. I got very emotional, concerned, scared, very normal reactions when you hear someone is missing.
Sure.
And he got very angry with me, and that is very bothersome. But they are very stoic. I only saw Steve cry about the situation one time, only one time. I never saw any other members of the family cry about Joan being missing. Steve cried when he was under sedation having wisdom teeth pulled about a month and a half later.
What was your reaction to him chastising you for crying? He thought that was inappropriate. Despite, you say, the family conducted themselves very stoically, did you still think there was something to his reaction or not?
Well, you process things based on what your experience is. I know that we had just gone through a miscarriage. Steve was very immature. I didn't react to it in a hostile way. I tried to be very sensitive toward him, but considered that, he just was not capable of handling all the emotions. And he never really did go through a grieving process. The family, you look at their reactions, and I understood that they had a background in the CIA. They never broke down even during private family times, which was very concerning to me. I spoke to Steve's mother about it, going, the family needs to grieve. You need to process. I didn't understand that is, the way that they behaved on a regular basis. They don't deal with issues. They block them out. And it is concerning. They block them out yet today.
Now, how do police proceed with this disappearance? How do they proceed with this? Where do they go in terms of questioning, and how do they proceed? Tell us about that.
The case was very sensational. As I said, it was highly publicized. They settled on an explanation fairly early on. I did not realize they had come to this determination as early as they did, but they focused on a man named Leonard Paradiso, and they focused on him based on an anonymous call they received in January of 1982, so only a few weeks into Joan's disappearance. The story that came out was that they believed that Leonard Paradiso had picked her up at the airport, taken her to his boat, which was down at Pier 7, and said that he murdered her on his boat and then dumped her in Boston Harbor. For a long time, there really was no other explanation, so as not to believe that. But that story didn't come out until a full year later. That story came out in January of 1983. Digging into the records, I could see how the process went along for that year trying to implicate this man for her murder. It really was an extraordinary explanation, but no one had anything to dispute it. It was coming from the authorities. It was being agreed with by the parents, so no one was going to dispute it at that time. That story is still being recycled, that she was murdered on Paradiso's boat. The only difference is the fact that she was found in 1990. Her remains were found buried more than 30 miles from the crime scene. So they kind of reworked the ending to suggest that Paradiso had removed her from the boat, her bludgeoned body, taken her to a very remote area, heavily wooded area, and buried her remains.
Who is Leonard Paradiso in terms of his background? And again, what was the theory that police had that he came in contact with her at the airport? Give us more of the supposed background between these two people, how they came to bump into each other faithfully.
Okay. Leonard Paradiso was someone who, he was a parolee at the time, and he had a record. He had been a suspect in a 1979 murder, a woman named Marie Iannuzzi. He was not the only suspect in that case, but he was a suspect because he had attended the same wedding as this woman, and he became a logical person to question. That case went cold. The other suspect in that case was a man named David Doyle, who was the woman's boyfriend, and they had a known abusive relationship. When the anonymous call was placed in January of 1982, a woman implicated Leonard Paradiso for both crimes, both the Iannuzzi murder and for Joan's disappearance. Her story, which she later testified to in court, was never corroborated, never verified. It was a 10-year-old allegation, and suspiciously, it was very similar to the story that they were trying to suggest as far as what happened to Joan. She claimed that Paradiso had threatened to dump her in the ocean where no one would ever find her, and of course that's what the police were promoting as far as what they suggested happened to Joan, that she was dumped in the ocean and was not going to be found. And it was very convenient because no body had surfaced. No one had any idea what had happened to Joan. When her remains...
And the motive... Sorry.
His motive...
What was the supposed motive for all of this, though?
His motive would have simply been a random act. They claimed he was driving a gypsy cab at the airport, although there is no evidence to support that whatsoever. He was a parolee. He could not get a hack license, and there are no witnesses that testified to the fact that he drove a cab at any time, ever. It was a story that basically was compounded every step of the way, trying to fit this crime to this man, basically trying to prove that he murdered Joan Webster. Nothing supports it. When her remains...
Now, who is this? Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, who is Robert Bond? And you talked about an anonymous informant, but Robert Bond is a criminal informant. So tell us about Robert Bond and what he had to say, if I'm not jumping ahead.
Okay, Robert Bond is the person that stepped into the picture in January of 1983. He was a convicted murderer, and he was in the Charles Street jail, not far from Leonard Paradiso's cell. They were a few cells apart. He is the man who the police went to and worked on a story and a statement claiming that Leonard Paradiso confessed to him that he had murdered Joan on his boat and dumped her in Boston Harbor. Robert Bond had absolutely no credibility whatsoever, but his statement was sealed, and when he came forward and testified in the Iannuzzi case and also in a pretrial hearing, he was implicating Paradiso for Joan Webster as well. So conveniently, the police had an informant who could give them a story that tied both of these cases together. And all through the media, all through the press, these two cases were tied together, even though there were no similarities whatsoever. Marie Iannuzzi was found strangled. She was garroted with her own neck scarf, and she was dumped out on a rocky bank near the Pine River. Joan, at this point in time, was still a missing person. Nothing suggested that she had been even murdered at that point. We just plain didn't know. There were signs that there was foul play. Her purse had been found, and by January of 1982, her suitcase had been found. She did also carry a tote bag that was never recovered. So Robert Bond was a snitch that came forward, worked with the police. They came up with a statement. At the time, I had no idea what the statement said. Those are part of the recovered documents now, and the statement that he gave was false.
Now, were there some assurances, promises, something to benefit from Robert Bond's testimony favorable for the prosecution?
Absolutely. He was promised that they would reduce his charges to manslaughter for the second murder that he had just been convicted of. His case did get retried. He was convicted a second time. He did not get manslaughter, even though he had been promised manslaughter. He had also been promised and enticed with the Webster family reward. So he had been certainly seduced to go along and give the state what they wanted.
Now, what's your theory in this, that why police and prosecutors were so adamant in railroading Paradiso? Why were they so evident? Why were they put evidence aside just to be able to make this case work? What is your theory and reasoning why they did that?
Leonard Paradiso was a convenient scapegoat for them. And what I did not understand, I understood at the time that they found Joan's remains in 1990 that this theory that they had promoted, this boat theory, was probably not the correct theory. They had the wrong guy. And I know that for certain things that I knew as a part of the immediate family. In 1983, a grand jury had rejected the boat theory. So there was never a true bill handed down. No one was ever charged or tried for this crime. Joan had been found 30 miles from the alleged crime scene, and she had also not been dumped in Boston Harbor. So I knew that this indeed was not the correct answer for what had happened to Joan. But there was a great deal that I did not know. I can speculate about the time in Boston when things went on there. This was a very corrupt period in Boston's history. There was a lot of corruption. The FBI protected criminal informants. I had no idea the circumstances surrounding the Iannuzzi case or the exculpatory evidence that was available in that case but hidden in other case files. Basically, you've got a case here of public corruption. The authorities manufactured an explanation for Joan's loss. Why would they do that? Well, you either have to look at them wanting to, boost themselves as heroes finding the answers, but the Websters were extremely involved in this case. They were meeting with the FBI. They were corresponding with the FBI. I know personally that they were in Boston all of the time. They had a heavy hand in the direction that this case took, and they also were the ones that were extremely influential for people to believe this. People sympathized with them. Here these parents have lost their daughter. If the Websters say they believe this, then people went along with it. And the authorities were going along with it as well. The authorities did one of two things. They either lied to the Websters or they lied for them. And going through and recovering the documents that I have, seeing the evidence that I have, and my personal experiences with the Websters, I'm very concerned that it's the latter, because they are completely ignoring evidence that has come to light now. And part of that evidence is...
Sorry. I just want to make it clear. You're saying that it's a cover-up in terms of the Websters have lied.
The Websters have not been honest. The Websters withheld evidence. One of the pieces of evidence that they withheld was a composite. It was speculated and spread a lot that Joan had just waved to a couple of friends and then vanished without a trace from Logan Airport on that Saturday night. That's not the case. There was a composite. A cabbie came forward, provided a description. He had seen Joan with a man at the airport, and a composite was put together. I knew nothing about that composite until I started digging into this case. That composite was suppressed. It was never broadcast. It was never published. And that's not the normal behavior of authorities or the family if you're looking for a missing person. The composite is frightening. I recovered it. It is in the book. I disclose it in the book, as well as a comparison with someone that it looks very much like. The Webster family withheld that. They also withheld George Webster's private phone number. So the family, they twisted and distorted things as well. For example, Joan had just completed a project. It got spun, and all of a sudden Joan is going back early. That's an explanation no one was going to dispute coming from the father, but his explanation was that she went back early to work on a project when that is just what she had just completed.
Right.
A lot of little twists in there. And I mean, this is a family that has CIA background. They're very good at creating perceptions.
Now, you include a bunch of famous cases, including Casey Anthony, Drew Peterson, a bunch of cases, high-profile cases that I'm sure you've included for some really good reason to demonstrate or illustrate the connection to this. So tell us why you did include those stories and what was the gist or what was the point in including those stories in this book.
The reason I put those cases and listed them up front, because people really need to stop and think how cases pan out. The majority of murder are committed by people that the victim knows. And in those cases where I've illustrated, sometimes there is a family connection. It is horrifying for us when we do realize, for example, the Casey Anthony case. She lied. She made up a story. When people understood that she had provided false information, withheld information, she became a logical suspect. In her case, the police were not participating in fabricating and promoting that story. In this case, the police are the ones that are fabricating the story and promoting Leonard Paradiso as the culprit in the crime, when there is no evidence whatsoever that connects him to the crime at all. I've been through every single piece of so-called evidence. I've been through the witnesses. I've been through the associated cases that were tied to Leonard Paradiso. It was a corrupted case. The legitimate investigators who might have gotten to the truth were taken down a primrose path. Things were diverted. Let me give a good example. In the epilogue of a book was written in 2008 by the former prosecutor, Tim Burke, who was assigned to the investigation. Right. In the epilogue of his book, he lists a bankruptcy fraud case, and he provides the name of Richard Stearns as the judge and gives a date of November 1st, 1985. That's completely false information. From sworn affidavits, I can look and I can read that he instigated this case. Tim Burke contacted the FBI, got them involved in a bankruptcy fraud case against Leonard Paradiso. Leonard Paradiso had filed for bankruptcy in 1981, in August of 1981. Among the things that he did not list in his bankruptcy was the boat, the alleged crime scene. And the authorities had the information right at the time that they came out with this theory. It's in documents, it's in sworn statements, it's in court records, that they had knowledge that the boat had been reported missing. The trial that he misrepresents in his book actually took place in April of 1985. And Judge Bruce Celia in Rhode Island, the Federal District Court in Rhode Island, after reviewing all of the evidence, which was not contested at all, determined that the boat did not exist in August of 1981, 4 months before Joan Webster disappeared. So the crime scene did not even exist. And yet they continued their media reports where both Tim Burke and the lead officer on the case, Andrew Palumbo, got on TV, continued to promote that Joan had been murdered on this boat, dumped in Boston Harbor. It wasn't until 1990 when her remains were found that it shifted a little bit, and they suggested, well, yes, he murdered her on the boat, but then moved her 30 miles away and buried her. That's not even remotely impossible. It's impossible. You can't murder someone on a boat that did not exist. And Tim Burke's 2008 book indicates that his story still is, and the book was supported by the family, that Joan was murdered on this boat. And he gives a horribly graphic description of her being raped and murdered. What I'd like for listeners to know is how she was really found, because it's equally as horrific, but it did not happen in the way that the family and the authorities describe. The way Joan Webster was found was she had a 2 by 4 inch hole in the side of her head. It took out the entire right side of her skull. That was an enormous blow with a bat, a crowbar, a limb, something that was swung with enormous force that cracked her skull and literally took out the entire right side. She had been stripped of all clothing. She had been completely stripped. There was nothing in the area that was Joan's, with the exception of a ring and a gold neck chain that were still on the skeleton when they found the remains. She had been completely stripped, and she was thrown out in a black plastic trash bag. The family, after finding the remains and learning how their daughter had been murdered and disposed of, had her cremated. And cremation, in effect, and I did not understand this until I dug into this case, cremation effectively shuts down the investigation. The state can only release a body, a murder victim, for cremation after all legal avenues have been exhausted. And they never had an inquest against the man that they continue to accuse of the murder. They just shut down the case and then continued to accuse him.
Let me ask this. I want to hear and explain to the audience that the dynamic present here. You're married to Joan's brother and Steve, and you're claiming that the family is hiding these secrets. They're conditioned to do that. They're CIA, both the father and the mother. So the family's grown up with that. What is the dynamic between you and Steve based on your doubts about the family, and when exactly did you have this sort of moment where you said, I got to get involved, and tell us why you got involved, and when that one, I guess, decisive moment came when you said, I want to get involved here, and I'm this story doesn't seem to ring true, and I'm going to become involved. And then what was the dynamic between you and Steve, being her brother and part of this secretive CIA family?
Steve and I were married for 25 years. We divorced the end of 2004. It was a mediation. There was, no strain or dispute going back and forth. We just simply divided things. We had 2 daughters, and in 2001, I discovered a letter that my daughter had written. It was in a desk drawer, and I found it trying to find car keys. Probably the most numbing experience of my life. My daughter alleged in her letter, which has been authenticated and the implications verified by multiple people, that her father sexually abused her. I cannot prove or disprove that happened. But what I can establish is that I immediately sought help to try and get to the truth, understand what my daughter's meaning was, and what had happened. I know that the behaviors of my children, I have 2 daughters, became very different, very hostile, very angry, and their anger was directed at me. It was not something I could understand. The Webster family has a very strong image. People like them. They're fun to be around. They're interesting people. But it's not the dynamic of who they are behind closed doors. And what I found was a family that would not sit down and discuss the issues. I basically was alienated from my daughters, and I became a victim of being very devalued and literally discarded. When I started to dig into this case, it was my fervent hope that I would find something to justify the family's belief and support of Tim Burke's book, because they came out publicly supporting it. I had gone through a series of experiences with them that just didn't add up. And what I found when I dug into it was that their behaviors in Joan's case matched more the experience that I had than the experience that the public viewed of them looking for their daughter. They were not honest, they were not open, they will not discuss anything. I've already presented them with facts. If authorities lied to them, I'd be in their corner 100%. This was a horrible, horrible nightmare to live through. To relive it, going through these documents, was equally as horrifying, but even more so seeing the deception that was going on and seeing a man framed. A man was framed. There was exculpatory evidence for him in the Iannuzzi case. They persecuted this man and went after him with a vengeance that's just unimaginable. The Websters are very secretive. That certainly comes out of the condition of their CIA and activities that they may have been involved in. They were not things that they discussed, but I can take personal knowledge and time and place of certain things and know that they certainly were aware, and they were in a time and a place to have been involved in some things that most people in a modern, decent, open society would not approve of. Whether they felt justified for that as part of the CIA, I don't know. I'm sure that they probably did. And I'm sure that family members, Joan, the other sister Anne, and Steve, were all very conditioned to keep secrets. And that is what exists today. They are extremely codependent. My children are in a position now where they believe that their sense of security is in keeping family secrets. I certainly don't agree with that. I understand it, but I certainly don't agree with that. When people have done things that are wrong, every victim should speak out.
Now, let me ask this question. In terms of Tim Burke's book, what does he claim is the motive behind Paradiso kidnapping Joan Webster? And then what do you think, once you tell us that motive, what do you think as a result in terms of what did your husband think of this motive that the family was supposedly supporting coming from Tim Burke and through his book?
They are supporting the motive that this was a random act, that Joan was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Leonard Paradiso picked her up. They labeled him as a sexual predator, have gone to the point where they label him as a serial killer now. I could find no evidence that he ever killed anybody. He did have scrapes with the law. He was a parolee for an assault conviction.
That's it?
That's it. He had an 8th grade education. He's not someone who could have gone out and just completely baffled everybody. Everyone, the blood members of the family, both of Joan's siblings and his father, his mother is now deceased, are lockstep with that and won't discuss anything further. And as I found going through the records, there were authorities that had come forward to them and said this isn't right, and they didn't pay attention. They had decided in their minds this is what happened to her. Basically, it's their story and they're sticking to it. They don't want people to dig into their closet. And unfortunately, I was someone who saw a different side of the Websters than what the public sees. And they are very image conscious. Image management, that's what I'm a casualty of. I knew too much about the family.
Now, what year did you become involved and start and, undertake this incredible task of finding out the truth and digging in and doing the research and asking people and digging up, unearthing some of this information? What year did you officially start that, and when did this book when did you finally wrap up the book itself?
I began to be really suspicious when an article came out on November 28th, 2006 that was the 25th anniversary of Joan's disappearance. I was going through enormous struggles with the Webster family, who had alienated not only myself but my entire side of the family from my children. The article came out with the family support, and I knew at that point this was wrong. They are influencing my children to believe things that aren't real or to go along with the family line. I started to dig into the case in 2007. Didn't really get to records until maybe the middle of 2008 and into 2009. I hired a private investigator and an attorney in Boston to help me. All the records have been, procured in a very proper way and are verifiable, and I got to thousands of pages of records. Fortunately, having been part of the family, I think I even understood to look in a couple of places that other people had not. I retrieved police records from Glen Ridge, New Jersey, which was the hometown. I found a great deal of information there, including the composite that had been suppressed, and learned once I got into that the family had that composite in the first couple of weeks of Joan's disappearance. And I didn't know about it until 2009. And the image in that composite is extremely frightening. It resembles the lead officer who was involved in the case.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. As I started to dig into it, I understood I had to go back and research the climate in Boston at that time. Both the DA's office that was involved, where Tim Burke worked, Suffolk County DA's office, had been exposed in 1991 for corrupt cases that covered the years that they were investigating Leonard Paradiso, 1980 to 1988. His situation fell right in the middle of it, and they had corrupted cases. The FBI, that was the Whitey Bulger era, they protected criminal informants. And one of the things I learned in digging into this case, that there was a confidential source providing false information to the FBI about Joan's case. That's the individual who also resembles the composite. I was able to determine through other sources who indeed that was. And it wasn't even that difficult to figure out because I could see what information was being provided. The Robert Bond statement claiming Joan was murdered on the boat and dumped in Boston Harbor. There was a confidential source reporting on a gun that they miraculously discovered under where Paradiso's boat had been sunk, even though the legitimate investigators had missed it for 2 months. The confidential source provided information to find a witness, a woman named Charlene Bullerwell, who gave incredible testimony. And I'll never forget the day that this article landed on my kitchen counter. This woman claimed that Leonard Paradiso was a hitman for the mob. He chopped up bodies, tied cinder blocks to them, and dumped them in the ocean. For years, I spent vacations looking in the water, wondering if Joan was down there. That's a horrible thing to do to people, and there's nothing that corroborates that story whatsoever. The interesting thing in FBI files was that Tim Burke claimed that Charlene Bullerwell, they had a photograph of her wearing Joan's missing bracelet. To my knowledge, the bracelet was never found, but the only people who could identify that bracelet were the Websters. So why did Tim Burke claim that this woman was wearing Joan's bracelet? The pieces didn't add up, but all the tiny little tweaks and things. To be honest, I think Tim Burke was manipulated. He may have legitimately believed that Paradiso was responsible for murdering Joan early on, so he was willing to pervert another case to nail him. They had absolutely nothing to go after him for Joan. Nothing. All of the evidence was manufactured.
So could the prosecutor have convinced the family? Again, it's a confluence of events here and motivations and and reasonings why people do things, but would the family then possibly been convinced by the prosecutor too that despite some holes in some of this and lack of evidence, that certainly this was their culprit? And again, with the CIA background, did the family not believe that there was that it just happened to be this guy working for the mob or capable of doing such an atrocious crime, would have no connection with them as CIA personnel?
I'm not sure, in looking through the records, how I can believe that they were lied to so convincingly. Tim Burke was not the least bit convincing. His prime suspect, a man that he pursued for years, Leonard Paradiso, when he published his book, for the first edition that came out, suggested or said that Leonard Paradiso was born in Italy. Leonard Paradiso was born in Boston. That was extremely easy to find out. Tim Burke had to have had his back covered to publish this book because the documents did exist to refute, what he was coming out and suggesting. He suggests that he wrote the book at the encouragement of the Websters. He says that in his epilogue of the book. The family went and visited him in 2005, and after that he came out and wrote the book. I can't figure out why that would convince them, why he would be so convincing to them. None of the evidence matched up whatsoever. Is it possible that they withheld information from them about the boat not existing, findings from the trial that took place in Rhode Island in 1985? It's possible. I was lied to, so, I certainly can understand someone being lied to. They were very close to it. They seemed to have their hands in everything that was going on. They even drove up to Summers in Connecticut in 1987 at a time when there was a push to try and get Robert Bond, the two-time convicted murderer who was their informant, to testify and take Paradiso to trial in Joan's case. That was before her remains were found. If they were going to do it, they had to have Robert Bond. The Webster family was involved every step of the way. One of the things I found inappropriate in there was the fact that the Websters received an assurance from another witness that the state used, a man by the name of Tony Pisa. Tony Pisa was a man who was once on death row. He came forward with a story that was completely unverifiable. It was a he-said situation, no way to verify it whatsoever, and pretty far-fetched. And that man's a free man today. He got out of jail, and he made assurances to George Webster that he wasn't really interested in the reward money for coming out and talking. It was the witnesses such as those, Robert Bond and Tony Pisa, that convicted Leonard Paradiso in the Iannuzzi case. There were only 3 people that suggested that Paradiso was involved in both crimes. It was Robert Bond, Tony Pisa, and the woman who placed the anonymous phone call.
Right. Now, in all of this, you published your book. What does your husband have to say? What is his reaction in terms of your investigation, in terms of your book, and in terms of your allegations?
I have tried to ask the Websters questions all along the way, and they knew I was digging into this. I have been a little bit surprised by the reaction. As I said, my initial hope was to find something that justified the Websters coming out and supporting this theory, the boat theory. The reactions have been very unusual, to say the least. I have been harassed. I have been threatened. And those are things that can be tied directly back to the Websters. Steve's sister Ann has sent some very harassing emails. And George Webster, Joan's father, as of Christmas 2012, Christmas night, and I listed several things where there were discrepancies in the records versus what they were supporting, I asked to sit down in a proper setting to discuss them. And he was very juvenile, name-calling, harassing, threatening, vulgar language, and his last line in the email to me was die. That to me is a very threatening comment to come from my former father-in-law, who I lived through this experience with them, and here his daughter was brutally murdered. The case has never been solved. I've dug out information. It's all verifiable, and he wishes me to die. The Webster family wants to support that Joan was murdered in a random way, wrong place at the wrong time, picked up by this man, murdered on his boat. And that's impossible. The boat did not exist.
Now, without giving away everything that's in the book in terms of your conclusions, point our audience that's been listening so far in the direction of where you think the motive lied in terms of her murder.
The motive certainly has to do with secrets in the family secrecy, whether that's their business involvement or personal things. I can't say specifically, although I have reason to be concerned about their personal behavior within the family. I certainly am concerned for the safety and well-being of my children. If the family is certainly complicit in covering up this crime. There is no question. They are obstructing justice at this point in time. If they had involvement in the crime, then that puts my children at risk, and it certainly put me at risk. Their secrecy about what was going on in the investigation and being truthful about what the evidence was, who legitimate suspects were, and whatnot, it's frightening. And if you've got someone who is involved in the investigation who's equally as interested in keeping a lid on this case, it certainly explains the dynamics of what's going on. That's where the pieces fit. And, it's a case of public corruption as far as the story that was contrived. Whether the Websters were involved or not involved, that's something that a legitimate investigation needs to research. I spoke with Special Agent Michael Carrazza in the Public Corruptions Unit of the FBI, and he indicated to me that the first thing in any case that should be done is for the family to be looked at. That's true in any case. That never happened in this case. George Webster took over the investigation. He really ran the show, and because of the Webster's influence, being very available to the media, constantly making comments, they sat through the Iannuzzi trial. They were constantly in the public's eye as, a grieving family looking for their daughter and naming Paradiso as the culprit. It influenced a lot of lives and in very negative ways. So, yeah, the family needs to answer some questions.
Now, you say the family had access to media, and the media utilized statements from George and from the family. How about your book and, again, the statements and facts that you have unearthed and the allegations that you have made, especially including the family? What is the media, that same media's response to your book? Has it been lukewarm? Has it been cold? Has it been warm? What's been the reception?
It's been very cold, and I think part of the reason is the influence of the authorities out east. They don't want this case opened up. I provided the assistant district attorney because I've approached going through proper channels, as anyone as a witness should, going to proper authorities. They've been provided documents. It's staring them right in the face. They have no answers for it. But what has happened as a result of it, a confidential piece of information that I provided the current assistant DA who is custodian of Joan's files, as well as 3 Massachusetts state troopers. I provided them with confidential information. That information was then later distorted and misrepresented to the public to paint me in a very negative way. I tried to come forward with documents at the Massachusetts Parole Board in 2011 to give a victim impact statement regarding Robert Bond. I had his written statement about what happened to Joan. I had his testimony. I'd met with him face to face. I know that his statement was false, and authorities would have known it was false at the time that they took it. I provided documentations to fully support my statement. I was not allowed to make the statement. I'm properly certified with the Department of Corrections, but people got on the phones and they were talking to each other. They blocked me from coming forward and speaking out. This book really came to fruition because it had to come out. There has to be public awareness. If you've got a case that is controlled by people with an interest to hide it and cover it up, because there's a pretty big history in Boston of just this type of thing, then you've got a system, a totally dysfunctional system that does not work, that can leave people victimized all over the place. And if I go back to my children and the allegations that my daughter made, if that's the kind of abuse and violence within a family where they've got an unresolved murder, what are the dire consequences of lying and covering up a crime, who they have hurt along the way? I'll protect my children, and I'll be as bold as I need to. I have documents to back me up, and this is an incredible case.
Now, were they able to point at your particular situation of alleging that your husband abused your child based on this letter? Are they seeing this as this extreme case of sour grapes, that you have this allegation and then a belief, and then it grows into an overall belief that they could cover up something of even a more grievous nature, like murder of the daughter, Joan? So were they able to include all of this and sort of give it as some sort of testament that you might not be credible because of it?
I've had a lot of people make that judgment and think that I have the type of character that I would ever make up any sort of thing against my ex or my family. No, these were people that I loved and trusted, and they know me as a person with a strong core and a strong character. Is that what's being portrayed? Yes. I didn't make the allegations against my ex-husband. My child did. That letter has been authenticated and verified by 3 counselors that were working with the family. It's been reported to the police. It's in a police file. It's become part of the public record in a court case, a contempt hearing I had against my ex-husband. Even my ex-husband had verified that letter, as well as my child's sister verified it in writing. Those are all things that I have. They're documented. The FBI here in my locale here, when I received the threatening email from Joan Webster, the FBI agent looked at all 3 components that I was dealing with, because I'm really dealing with 3 things here. I'm dealing with allegations that my child made, and I, as a mother, standing up for her, which God only hopes that every parent that would come across such a nightmare would try and stand up for their child. That's number 1. The second part of it that I'm dealing with are the unique background of this family, how they deal with things, their dysfunction to be able to sit down and discuss things, their alienating and devaluing behavior. That's not treatment I deserved in any way, shape, or form. People did know me. And the third factor is an unresolved murder in the family, where the family is supporting an impossible theory. And there are documents, court records, police reports, an abundance of records that support that this is a false assertion that is still being promoted by the state and the family. So, yeah, the FBI agent that looked at those 3 components indicated that my child's letter should have been investigated and asked if that was something to pursue at this time. They're both adults now. I've been trying to deal with that, and that was the first and foremost thing I tried to deal with for many years without really making the connection other than the behaviors just didn't add up. You know, the behaviors, the image of a family looking for their missing daughter and the image of this family basically eliminating me because I was not one who was just going to close my lips and not try and help my child understand what was wrong and get her the proper help. I was driven for my children, and in a pretty brutal way.
Yeah,
so no,
that's sad.
You know, I have no animus. I'm angry. I'm very angry. The family was not honest, and they're still not being honest. You can't ignore facts to suggest that they don't exist. Ignoring things does not change the facts, and the facts are in the documents, and I've got an abundance of them, and many have been provided to many different departments. I just recently received a letter from Governor Chris Christie, as well as from his Attorney General's office. I appealed to Governor Christie to look into this case because Joan was a New Jersey resident legally. She was a student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but she was a legal resident of the state of New Jersey at her parents' home at the time this crime happened. He took it seriously and forwarded information to his Attorney General. His Attorney General did write me back that they felt the more appropriate place for it to be investigated is with the Attorney General in Massachusetts. Martha Coakley already denied a request to try and look into this, and she has an unusual relationship with Tim Burke. She was named as someone who had made a verbal agreement entitling him to some very valuable beach property that he's trying to fight for right now against the city of Marshfield, Massachusetts. So, you know, you got a good old boys club out there where people will cover for each other rather than explain, tell me how Mr. Paradiso could have murdered my sister-in-law on a boat that didn't exist. I want people to go back and focus on the facts. And if there's an explanation for it, it certainly would have come out by now. If they had a real justification for implicating this man, it would have come out by now because there's been plenty of heat to get to the truth in this. And what they seem more interested in is trying to keep me quiet. That's why this book had to come out.
Now, is that the new development positive development that you were talking about before the interview?
One of the new developments was hearing back from Governor Christie and from his Attorney General. Right. Another thing that happened since this book has come out, the woman who placed the anonymous phone call in January of 1982 implicating Leonard Paradiso for both the Marie Iannuzzi murder and for Joan's disappearance, she verified that she placed that anonymous call. Now, she did that, but at the same time, she also disputed something that's in court records. Court records, and I do have it documented in my book, Tim Burke claimed that she placed an anonymous call to the Websters as well, implicating Paradiso for Joan's murder. She claims she did not make that call. Well, one of the two of them is lying. Either Tim Burke manufactured a story or he's got to discredit his witness, who she was never a credible witness to begin with. This was a 10-year-old allegation with absolutely nothing to support it. She went in and made up a story. What was interesting is that she was an acquaintance. She grew up with not only Leonard Paradiso, but she also grew up with one of the police officers who was very integrally involved in this case, a man by the name of Sergeant Carmen Tamero, who was the lead officer's superior, and he was very involved in this case. Robert Bond, the convicted murderer that they got to make a statement, was led through an interview by Carmen Tamero, and when he was disgruntled with his outcome, not getting the things that he felt he had been promised, he filed a motion with the court, and he named specific names. He named Tim Burke. making promises. He named Andrew Palumbo making promises. He named Carmen Tamero making promises. And that document is actually in the book. I do have a few documents that I've put in the back of the book. There are so many more that it was impossible to, put everything in there, but I am posting some things up online on a Facebook book page about this case so that people can truly see that I'm not out. I'm out to get to the truth. And I'm out to get to the truth for two very important reasons. My children's well-being and safety, number one, and the only thing that you can ever give to a deceased member of your family, the truth. That's the only way you can value and respect their lives. Joan was an incredible person, a wonderful person, and if indeed, she was about to spill the family secrets, perhaps to me, I was pregnant at that time. Perhaps she wanted to tell me about, the way this family encouraged or forced secrecy within the family. I have the most admiration for her, and she has been a guiding force to really relive this whole experience all over again. And it's been a nightmare all over again. When I saw a picture of Joan's skull compared to, what was described to me, what had happened to her, and I could see for myself the skull, there was no way that she was hit in the head with a whiskey bottle in a cramped little boat cabin. And by that point, I knew that the boat didn't exist. I couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. This has been an enormous amount of grief to deal with. But I'm a rock-solid person, and if anyone chooses to question or challenge, I'm happy to go through that process. I'm happy to go through that process with the documents. And unfortunately, the authorities who should be interested in the truth are not the ones doing it. But other measures have been taken. I am waiting a response for a complaint that was filed to try and have this case removed from its current jurisdiction because they're not legitimately looking at this case.
It's interesting, too, that the family decided to do the cremation and not look for any kind of, like some things like a rape kit don't work after years and years, but if there was some obvious sexual assault, you say the body was found naked, no clothing whatsoever, but it is very curious and telling that the family would cremate their daughter, basically, without doing that. You would think they would want to have some answers, whatever answers they could derive from that autopsy.
Yeah, and I mean they did it. The remains went through a couple of months of forensic testing. I remember it seeming like an eternity before her remains were released, and we buried her. And there's another very unusual point. Her sister Anne did not come back for her sister's interment. It was just Steve and myself, Joan's parents, and the choir director from their church. That's it. We were the only ones graveside. And that always bothered me. Since this has been going on, you asked about some of the family's reactions. When I recovered FBI files, I found an incident in those files that I'd known about as part of the immediate family, but it was something that was never published in the press. It's never been, numerous books have talked about this case, at least 5 books that I'm aware of. And but this was something that was never discussed in any of these books, and that was an extortion incident that took place in October of 1982. I had a second miscarriage shortly after that incident happened. These were things that were very hard on you emotionally and physically. It was a very draining period. It went on for years and years. I asked about that extortion incident because no one had ever been charged for that. I was curious about it. I had asked the DA's office about it. My ex-husband lied to my brother and told him he didn't know of anything about anything like that. Couldn't think of anything that even remotely was like that at all. That conversation was taped, so I have him on record. You don't forget when your father is wired and you're put in a wired car and you're traveling across state lines with an extortionist and driven to a bogus address. The man by the name of Harvey Martel was taken to the FBI headquarters where he was questioned, wouldn't answer questions, and then was released. Never charged. It was in the FBI files. And one of the reports was initialed by William H. Webster, who at that time was the director of the FBI. So this had extremely high visibility. To repeat an incident like that sounds pretty crazy or pretty sensational unless you can back it up. And it wasn't until I got into the FBI records that I certainly was able to back it up and have been able to corroborate it in other files as well now.
You know, it's interesting you talk about all the time that has elapsed, and some people might say, geez, this woman isn't giving up, she's relentless. We just talked about the media's sort of lukewarm or kind of cool attention to this, we'll say, in terms of interest in. But I would say that you would not be the first person that, even though it's 25 years and it looks like nobody wants to remember this, that there are people out there very much like this audience that is interested in these kinds of cases, and I applaud you for this. Very concise, very, very, I mean, no one can, characterize you as going off on a tangent or hysterical, or you're very, very logical. And this book is very like a historical legal document. So it's not so much opinion. It's here are the facts, as many as you could dig up to point in a direction away from the official story. So I applaud you with this effort, and I think just hang in there. I think you're going to, there are some promising signs. So,
yeah, I'm chipping away, and as I said, the book is really witness testimony, and at least that's how I view it. And in addition, I'm pursuing the legal avenues that I have or that I can think of, and I feel like I've earned a couple of extra degrees along the way, just trying to figure out how do you unravel a case like this. I mean, I was half the country away and, more than a quarter century trying to figure out what really happened. I have really had to dig, and I've had to dig hard. I know I've hit nerves. My heart would break for the Webster family if they were lied to and they truly believed it. But you have to look at their inability, their dysfunction, to discuss anything other than, nope, this is what happened, and to devalue and besmirch anyone who disagrees with what they say. And that it's a patriarchal family. That is kind of how he operated, only I didn't grow up that way. I grew up to be an independent thinker, get the facts for myself, and what I learned and what I uncovered was not at all what I was led to believe at the time. And it's heartbreaking.
Yes. I want to congratulate you on this and coming on and doing this great interview about Mummies of Mole, Unraveling the Joan Webster Murder and Other Secrets in a CIA Family. Now, Eve, for those that have listened to the program and they might want to contact you to maybe give you some information or contact you further, you said you had a Facebook page, a fan page for this book. Tell us how people might be able to contact you if they're so inclined. Okay.
I'll give you two websites. One is the Facebook page, and that's www.facebook.com/mole, M-O-L-E, Eve Carson, EVECARSON. That's the book webpage. You can also go to the actual book website, which is www.mommiesofmole.com. There actually is contact information there, both an email, Twitter, and a post office box. I would welcome anyone who has, even if it's suggestions on who do you turn to as a private citizen when you find corruption with the authorities in seeking justice for a case. Anyone who's got advice, things that they've experienced themselves, thoughts, I welcome it all. And I appreciate the time you've given me to talk about this case. It's a tough case, but, it's one where, everybody should be concerned. If you've got authorities that can do this to people's lives, they continue to devalue Joan. That she certainly does not deserve that. And if the consequences of their misconduct, their corruption, to throw off a case resulted in harm to my children should be facing off with the state of Massachusetts themselves. But they need support behind them to be able to speak as victims.
Yes. Well, thank you for this book and continuing the fight to find out the actual truth about your sister-in-law, Joan Webster. You said she was a great person, and everyone deserves the truth about what happened to them, especially when they die such a horrible, horrible death, and there's so many people that did love them. So I want to thank you very much and wish you the best of luck with this fight. Thank you very much, Eve Carson, for coming on and talking about Mummies and Mole.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Have a good night.
Night. You too.
Good night.